Let's get back to that situation on the Gaza border. The reopening of the Kerem Shalom crossing today points to a new stage developing in the relationship between Israel and Hamas. The possibility that these steps could be part of a more extended truce deal was strengthened by news of a secret meeting a few months ago between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Egypt's President el-Sisi to hammer out its details.
Right, and one of those details insisted on by el-Sisi would eventually involve Mahmoud Abbas's Palestinian Authority returning to Gaza. That idea has been criticized by hardliners and Netanyahu's coalition, who instead want a stronger military response against Hamas. Here with us to look at all the security implications on the ground, Brigadier General in the reserves, Relik Shafir, a former commander of Tel Nof Air Force Base. But first, let's jump back to our Middle East correspondent, Emily Rose, reporting for us this evening in Ramallah. Emily, we just heard a little bit about what the Israeli status is in terms of that deal, some internal divisions. What is the Palestinian reaction? Where is the Palestinian leadership in all of this?
Well, Nareed, earlier, senior Fatah member Azam al-Ahmad, he's also the envoy to those reconciliation talks that you mentioned. Well, he called the truce between Israel and Hamas a, quote, carnival. He said that it was treason, and he said that no deal between Hamas and Israel should exist without the presence of the Palestinian Authority. As for the reconciliation agreements, he said that talks were still ongoing and that they hoped to resolve several issues, but he didn't bring any firm conclusions from those talks just yet.
All right, Emily Rose there in Ramallah. Thank you for that report. Relik, reports coming out that perhaps the Israeli Security Cabinet has basically approved the deal, though they don't officially acknowledge or recognize it. But Naftali Bennett, the hardline education minister, already saying he's against any truce with Hamas now. He wants Israel, the Israeli military, to strike harder. Is this a time for Israel to enter some kind of truce with Hamas or to strike at it even harder?
Well, I think Mr. Bennett is looking at the upcoming elections. And he doesn't have the authority and therefore doesn't take responsibility. So when you're in a position and look at Mr. Lieberman, who's now defense minister, and listen to what he said a couple of years ago before he became defense minister. It played out for him in the elections, but now that he's has both the authority and responsibility, he understands the limits of power.
Right. He had said he would take out Hamas's leaders within 48 hours of becoming defense minister.
But obviously, when you're responsible and you have to look at the consequences of, okay, what happens next? And taking out Hamas means that Israel will have to take control of Gaza and be responsible for the livelihood of 2 million people, including their sewage system, water system, etc. And this is something that Israel doesn't want to do. And we're in a kind of a catch situation where if we put more military pressure on Gaza, we've seen that there are limits to what we can do without causing collateral effects that we don't want to handle. Plus the fact that the Gazans or the Hamas are looking at our problems in the north and are actually leveraging the fact that we don't want to open two fronts. It wouldn't look good either militarily or on the public scene. So they're using their leverage in what they can do. And as a matter of fact, we're looking for a long truce, and maybe the future will help the Palestinians. The Palestinians want something on the ground to see what's happening. They don't want to have the PLO as part of the deal. It's going to be stuck down their throat. It's not going to work. I don't think.
I want to pause here to add one more voice to the conversation that's sort of echoing what you said. This is the former director of the Counter-Terror Bureau in Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office, General Nitzan Nuriel. Here's what he told our Strictly Security earlier today.
What are you hearing about this long-term truce between Israel and Gaza? And what do you say to those in the Israeli government who say that this will just sap deterrence and reward terrorism?
We need to ask ourselves, what do we want to achieve? And if you ask, what is the Israeli policy in the long term, we are looking for quiet borders and good neighbors. And I believe that establishing a long-range ceasefire, it's very good for us and therefore we need to go for it.
Relik, so both Netanyahu and you are saying, well, we should have our eyes towards a longer-term deal. What has prevented that from ever happening in the past? Because every round of conflict is just one in a long list, and there's always a sort of commonly held understanding that the next round is inevitable.
Well, let's look at the Palestinian side, because when you're really dealing with somebody, it just so happens that you have to take and understand their side. I'm not saying accept, but at least understand. And the current situation where they're blocked, it's not sustainable. Hamas is not going away. They're going to be leading the Gaza for the foreseeable future. So perhaps the only viable solution, and I think everybody understands, is to enlarge Gaza. And as you know, it was President el-Sisi a couple of years ago who suggested enlarging Gaza up to el-Arish along the northern coast of the Sinai. Which means about 4 times the size. And that way, it won't be as highly populated, and they'll be able to build. That kind of a deal can only be struck on a multi-level, Israelis, Arabs, and so on.
Everybody together sitting at a table.
So everybody understands Hamas are there to stay. The connection with the PLO is probably not sustainable. And so this thing needs to work out, and it needs some kind of a strategy to look ahead at what is possible and how to make it work.
Relik, that's a bold strategy. Isn't one possible consequence that Israel would be dealing, maybe it is already dealing, with 2 Palestinian states or potential Palestinian states instead of 1?
Of course, this is, the writing is on the wall. The abnormality of Gaza and the West Bank isn't really possible, even if you think that most of the Gazans who live there are there Palestinians who had been either forced or escaped in 1948, and they're 2/3 of them are either people who had lived in Israel before or their children. So their kind of psyche is so much different from the ones in the West Bank, where the percentage of those is much lower. And so they have no escape routes. Even if they want to emigrate out of Gaza, they can't do it. So in order to solve this, we need to have some kind of some compassion. Compassion doesn't sell well in elections in Israel. And the more you're a hardliner, the less you can be compassionate. And this is what Naftali Bennett is playing on to catch maybe a couple, 3 more seats in the Knesset.
Relik, in the little time we have left, I want to ask you about security, because obviously you've worked very closely in terms of Israel's national security. When we see first there's rockets and underground tunnels, this time over the last few months it's been flaming kites and balloons. Is Israel just sort of chasing its tail, just putting one Band-Aid on another, trying to fix security solutions and not dealing with the bigger picture?
You know, I think it was Kissinger that said once that Israel has only internal domestic policies and not. This takes a serious and responsible, forward-looking strategy to formulate this. And so we will keep on with the Band-Aids until we're able to strike a deal with Hamas, with Egyptians, and the Arab world. This is something we can't do it alone. So we need to make all kinds of moves. This will probably look to Netanyahu as something that can hurt him during the elections. So I think in the short term, it's a kind of a catch of this particular government that may have to wait for after the election.
All right, Relik Shafir, many Band-Aids to eventually potentially heal that very deep wound.